Lian didn't think Shi Xuan would suddenly light a fire, and didn't even have the time to stop him before it was too late. The flames were exceedingly bright and revealed the silhouette of a black-clad man. The man in black had his head hung low against the stone wall at the end of the path. His face was as white as a sheet, and his hair was a mess. But underneath that messiness was a pair of eyes that shone with determination, like burning ice. Although he sat cross-legged, without a trace of discomfort, the stench of thick blood in the air indicated that he was gravely wounded and was obviously imprisoned here. Him saying, "I have nothing to say," was probably him mistaking them for interrogators. Shi Xuan saw his face and cried, "It's you!" That man didn't seem to expect other people either, and was taken aback, looking like he also wanted to say, "It's you." But alas, he held back. Lian calmed Ruoye, that was ready to attack. "So, you two know each other?" After crossing so many hurdles and finding someone, Shi Xuan looked relieved and was about to respond when the man cut in. He said in an indisputable tone, "I don't know him." Shi Xuan raged at those words and pointed at him with his fan. "Is it so shameful to know me? What hurtful words, Ming Xiong? I'm your best friend." The man denied it resolutely. "I have no friends that would run around in that sort of attire." Shi Xuan was still in his ragged purple silk dress, truly a shameful sight. Lian wanted to laugh at the thought that there were really people in this world who would use someone's best friend to validate themselves. It was definitely Shi Xuan's style. But Ming Xiong, if he remembered correctly, of the 5 elemental masters, the Earth Master's name was Ming Yi. Lian spoke up. "Are you perhaps Lord Earth Master?" "It's him. You've met him before," Shi Xuan replied. Lian looked Ming Yi over and said, "Have we?" He didn't recall ever meeting such a character. "You have," Shi Xuan said. "We haven't," Ming Yi stated. "Yeah, you have," Shi Xuan said exasperatedly. "Last time at the Banyue Pass, you guys didn't forget that this fast, did you?" Seeing Ming Yi's face go from pale white to grim, Lian finally remembered. Last time, when they met at the Banyue Pass, wasn't there a black-clad lady next to Shi Xuan? Hua Chang had already told him at the time that that wasn't the Water Master, but must also be one of the 5 elemental masters. As expected, Shi Xuan was not only passionate about transforming into his female form, but was also passionate about dragging others into doing the same. No wonder the black-clad lady at the time looked extremely pissed off and disgusted. Thinking back on how Shi Xuan begged him to join in on the fun, Lian sighed, thinking that it was a close call, and he was glad that he didn't relent. "Lord Earthmaster, was the ascending fire dragon set forth by you?" Lian asked. "It was," Ming Yi answered. They had found the right person. Lian nodded and said, "Lord Earthmaster is probably heavily wounded. We'd best make our escape now and talk later." Without any prompt, Shi Xuan knelt down and carried Ming Yi on his back. "Then let's get out of here." The 3 retraced their steps, and Shi Xuan talked as he walked. "I say, Ming Xiong, aren't you good at fighting? You were perfectly fine back at the Banyue Pass, so how did you get beaten up this bad in just several days? How did you piss off Crimson Rain Swordflower?" His tone was a teasing taunt, Lian mentally noted, speaking as though he isn't afraid of getting punched. They are indeed good friends. Ming Yi looked like he'd had enough of listening to Shi Xuan talk, and only said, "Shut up." Lian also wanted to know the answer to the same question, but changed his wording. "Lord Earthmaster, why would Hua Chang want to make things difficult for you?" Ming Yi didn't tell him to shut up, but he also didn't answer. Shi Lian turned his head slightly to look at him and saw that he had his eyes closed. After having been imprisoned and interrogated for days and also heavily wounded, after being rescued, Ming Yi must have finally let down his guard and could at last relax. It wasn't anything too urgent anyway, so Shi Lian didn't try to wake him. The three ran up the stairs, and Shi Lian threw out his dice at the top. He didn't know what number he tossed out in the dark, only that before them came a soft creaking sound, and a crack of light appeared. Shi Lian pushed at the door, and was just thinking about whether he'd have the chance to take Lang Ying with him, when he realized that the first step he took was hollow. The moment he felt himself fall forward, he cried, "Don't come out!" Shi Lian somersaulted in the air and fell onto something hard. He was just feeling relieved that it wasn't some bladed mountain or a sea of fire that he fell into, when he raised his head and realized that a bladed mountain or a sea of fire might have been a better alternative. Hua Chang's exceptionally handsome face was inches away from his brows raised, looking at him. This time, when the stone door opened, his hollow step made him fall on top of Hua Chang. The place of his fall was the armory. Hua Chang was seated on the throne of the armory, composedly wiping the scimitar Ming. Even when someone suddenly fell onto his lap from above, he'd only moved his hands away and stopped the cleaning without any air of surprise. He calmly looked at Shi Lian, as if waiting for an explanation. Of course, Shi Lian had none, and could only lay in his lap and stare back boldly. Suddenly, he saw another person at the peripheral of his vision, and when he turned around, he saw that it was Lang Ying. The bandaged boy was sitting on the floor, looking frightened, his hands grabbing his head, staring at the two of them. Why was Lang Ying here too? It looked as if Hua Chang was interrogating him, and when Shi Lian's eyes moved upwards, he saw half of Shi Qingshuan's white boot stepping out. There wasn't time to think, and in a hurry, Shi Lian gripped Hua Chang's shoulders. "I'm sorry," Shi Lian cried, then pushed Hua Chang aside. This push threw Hua Chang over a meter away, and he even tumbled a couple of times. After tumbling, Hua Chang immediately stood and steadied himself. And by then, Shi Qingshuan, carrying Ming Yi, suddenly jumped and landed with ease on the same spot where Hua Chang was just sitting. Shi Lian forced himself to look back, and Hua Chang was still looking at him without a word, but one side of his brows was raised even higher. Shi Lian leapt to his feet and backed off a few feet, apologizing as he did so. "I'm sorry." Lang Ying ran toward Shi Lian while watching Hua Chang, still appearing quite afraid, and hid behind him. Shi Lian shielded him and said, "San Lang, allow me to explain." "I'm waiting," Hua Chang responded. "Wait, isn't it the opposite?" Shi Qingshuan spoke up. "He should be the one who owes you an explanation. He's the one responsible for the missing heavenly official. Be wary, Your Highness." This was exactly the situation that Shi Lian didn't want to face. He looked at Hua Chang intently. "San Lang, I don't know what the misunderstanding was between you and the Lord Earthmaster, but let's all calm down and talk this out. The best case scenario would be Hua Chang letting them go without harm. Although the Earthmaster was wounded, his life was not at stake, and he wasn't missing any limbs. If he could drop it, then this wouldn't have to devolve into the worst case scenario. If Hua Chang let them leave and they reported back to the heavens, then they'd be in his debt, and Shi Lian could use it as a chance to ask Jun Wu to dismiss the whole thing. However, Hua Chang said instead, "Earthmaster? What Earthmaster?" After a pause, he continued, "Oh, did you mean the one that the Windmaster is carrying? He's nothing more than an inept subordinate of mine." Hearing this, both Shi Lian and Shi Qingshuan were taken aback. "He's obviously one of the heavenly officials. How dare you say otherwise?" Shi Qingshuan said. Hua Chang laughed. "Then, I wonder why your honorable heavenly official would hide his identity, drop his respectable title, and come work as an officer under me." Hua Chang drew out Ming in a crescent moon flash. If that is truly the Earth Master, then what patience to put on an act for 10 years. In the past 10 years, I had thought him suspicious from time to time, but there was no proof. If it wasn't for bumping into him and the Wind Master at Banyue, I'd still be in the clouds. In that moment, Shelian understood everything. So that's what had happened. The Earth Master went missing and was imprisoned, ultimately because he had hidden his true identity 10 years ago to go undercover as a ghost officer under Hua Chang. In other words, he was a spy. Hua Chang had thought his actions suspicious, but without concrete evidence, he'd only kept him under his watch. And it was only recently that Hua Chang finally uncovered his identity as the Earth Master. During that journey to Banyue Pass, Hua Chang had seen the Earth Master next to the Wind Master. Even under the disguise of a woman, Hua Chang still saw beneath that fake skin and discovered that the black-clad lady was the ghost officer that he suspected and locked onto his identity as one of the 5 elemental masters. After the whole ordeal at Banyue had concluded, Hua Chang probably left Puchi Shrine to go conclude things with the Earth Master. It may have been during Hua Chang's pursuit to kill, whilst under dire circumstances, that Ming Yi set off the distress signal. Then Jun Wu summoned Shelian and gave him the mission to run this rescue. That a heavenly official did not mind his duties, but instead went undercover in the ghost realm for over a decade, was quite the scandal. Never mind the politics behind it. If Ming Yi was to remain imprisoned and tortured, then all heaven would break loose if he was to actually die at Hua Chang's hands. It would be absolute chaos in the world. If that day were to come, then no one would be spared. After thinking all of this through, Shelian could only say, "I understand that the fault is ours. But San Lang, I hope you will let us go this time around." Hua Chang watched him intently, and after a moment said in a calm tone, "Your Highness, it's best not to get too involved in some things." Suddenly, Shi Qingshuan cried from the side, "Wind, come to me." The moment the fan came out, wild gusts started blowing through the armory. The many weapons hung on the walls and on the shelves started rattling. "Lord Windmaster, we haven't done anything yet," Shelian said, alarmed. "I don't think either of you are going to make a move first," Shi Qingshuan said, "so I'll be the bad guy this time. Wind, come to me." There was a huge cracking sound, and Shelian could feel the layers of dust falling on his head from above. He raised his head and saw that it was the roof that was being raised by the gusts, breaking at the seams into a large crack. The armory had no windows or other visible exits, and Shi Qingshuan had no intention to fight, but rather to escape through the crack on the roof. Within the mad winds, Hua Chang's raven black hair and maple red clothes flew wildly, but his person never moved. He smirked. "You have a fan, and coincidentally, so do I." From one of the many shelves, Hua Chang retrieved a fan. It was small and intricate, its spine and leaf made of pure gold, serene and beautiful. Hua Chang twirled it in his hand, snapping it open. He grinned wordlessly, elegant amidst his murderous aura. He flipped his hand and fanned, and a strong gust shot toward them with a blinding silver flash. The 3 dodged, and heard behind them the sound of hail-like darts smashing against the walls and ground. When they turned their heads to see, it was rows upon rows of golden foils nailed to the ground. Each foil was thin but deeply embedded, its sharpness apparent and vicious. Each weapon within this armory was a treasure to behold. Even a weapon he grabbed at random could have such a murderous effect. Hua Chang flipped his hand again, and another golden gust blew. The winds called forth by Shi Qingshuan were strong, but the stronger they were, the more dangerous the situation became. The armory was a mere chamber, its space limited. A portion of the winds raised by the Wind Master fan would rebound around the interior, hauling the golden foils along, dancing in the madness. Shelian was afraid that the golden foils would harm people, So he shielded Lang Ying and cried, "Lord Windmaster, please stop for now." The golden foils had continuously brushed closely against Shi Qingshuan and Ming Yi. Shi Qingshuan wanted to stop too. However, the roof had been raised by his winds, revealing a crack, and if he should stop now, all of his efforts would be wasted. Just then, the golden foils encircling them suddenly flew upwards uniformly. There was a cacophony of crackling before a person broke through the roof and jumped through the crack, debris and dust coming down with him. The moment he landed, the person shouted, "Lord Windmaster, I apologize, but I just couldn't sit still anymore." Shi Qingshuan was overjoyed. "Chen Chou, you've come in the nick of time." That young man carried a long sword, its blade the size of a grown man's palm. It was indeed Lang Chen Chou. His long sword was a shimmering gold, but looking at it closely, it wasn't because his sword was golden, but because it had sucked up all the golden foils, covering the blade completely, making it look as if it was a golden sword. Lang Chen Chou's sword was forged by a curious metal born of a lodestone mountain, and had the ability to magnetize metals. As long as the object of suction did not exceed a certain level of spiritual power, once he had the sword in his hand, he could mentally release its ability and magnetize all the surrounding metals, melting it into his blade. Sure enough, the innumerous golden foils were all soon sucked into the sword and dissolved into the blade. Seeing this, Hua Chang laughed aloud, closed his fan, and threw it behind him. Are the heavenly officials so pathetically poor that they couldn't let a teeny bit of gold go? If those words were directed at Shi Lian, he would only pretend not to have heard them, but they were directed at Lang Chen Chou, a noble born of royalty. He hadn't cared for riches his entire life, and although he knew that the enemy was intentionally taunting him, he was still boiling with rage. He raised his sword with both hands and struck toward Hua Chang. Hua Chang drew out his scimitar with one hand, generating silver shimmers in the air, calmly ready to welcome the attack. Lang Chen Chou's strike used all of his power. He was like a newborn bull, fearless of tigers. But Shi Lian had clearly seen the difference between their strengths, and if the strike was to land, he would die for sure. On the sidelines, even Shi Qingshuan, who was no swordsman, watched with alarm and yelled, "Chen Chou, don't!" But in that split second, how could a shout stop the arrow that's left the bow? Just as the blades of a sword and a scimitar were about to make contact, a blinding white light blew up within the armory. It was a sight so immense it covered every inch of the armory, and everyone lost their sight temporarily. All they could see was white. Shi Lian, however, was prepared and could still see with some difficulty. His right hand gathered all of the powers he had borrowed from Shi Qingshuan and created a giant flame and blazed it toward a random direction. The corner of the armory immediately caught on fire. Soon after, Shi Lian released Ruoye and wrapped himself, Shi Qingshuan, Ming Yi, Lang Chen Chou, and Lang Ying. He shouted, "Lord Windmaster, blow us upward." Even though Shi Qingshuan couldn't open his eyes, he still followed Shi Lian's directions. He raised his fan and snapped downward, and a violent twister formed from the flat ground, blowing toward the ceiling and, at last, breaking through the shaky roof. Ruoye had the 5 of them in a bundle and flew toward the sky. In mid-air, sight finally returned to many of them, and Shi Qingshuan could see that down below them there were giant flames ablaze, black smoke heavy in the air. The armory was burning. He was afraid Hua Chang would give chase and flapped his fan again. Now it really became fanning the flame. The blaze instantly erupted in size, and kindles landed on all the nearby buildings. Now over half of Paradise Manor was ablaze. With great difficulty, Shi Lian finally grabbed hold of Shi Qingshuan, who was fanning with all his might. "Lord Windmaster, please stop fanning. The whole place is going to burn down." Startled, Shi Qingshuan cried, all right, I'm stopping. Let me go, Your Highness. Your grip is too strong." It wasn't until the Windmaster stopped his winds that Xie Lian let go. He looked down, and amidst the red flames, Xie Lian was still able to spot a crimson silhouette. They were too high in the sky, and he couldn't see clearly, but his gut instinct told him that in that moment in time, Hua Chang was standing there, watching him. He didn't give chase and didn't put out the flames. He only stood there, letting the wildfire devour capriciously. Outside the Paradise Manor, screams and howling roared from all over the ghost streets, and crowds of ghosts ran amok. Xie Lian couldn't breathe, and his voice cracked, mumbling to himself, I only wanted to start a small fire, to create a distraction. How did it turn out like this? It was only a while earlier that Hua Chang had leaned against the doors of the armory, half-jokingly telling him that he wanted to gift him the entire armory with every weapon inside. But now everything was engulfed in a sea of fire. Although there may be many golden devices that were unafraid of intense heat, there were surely so many that could not touch flames. After all this burning, many treasures would become ashes. Xie Lian had not expected the flames to grow so violently, devouring the entire Paradise Manor. Even if Hua Chang didn't consider it a home, it was still his residence. Seeing how crushed Xie Lian was, Shi Qingshuan also felt bad. I'm really sorry, Your Highness. I didn't think it through and only wanted to escape faster. This is all my fault. It was most definitely a small flame at first. If Crimson Rain Sword Flower comes looking for payback, you just tell him to come to me. Don't worry, I can pay whatever amount. Money is never an issue. But money was definitely not the issue now. Xie Lian closed his eyes and couldn't speak. Shi Qingshuan patted his shoulder in consolation, but suddenly felt wetness in his palm and a strange, stark smell of blood. He turned his head to see, and his face lost color. Your Highness, what happened to your hand? Xie Lian's right hand was covered in blood. His entire right arm was thoroughly dyed with blood, and the trembling was not slight. Yet both his hands still sternly held onto that white silk band to keep everyone from getting blown apart by the wild winds. What's going on with you? Shi Qingshuan cried. Xie Lian blinked back and strained to steady himself before shaking his head. It's nothing, just a small injury. It'll get better once we get back. That white light was you? Shi Qingshuan remembered. Your Highness, you broke those two off? I'm a swordsman, after all, Xie Lian replied. Shi Qingshuan had guessed right. Right then, when the blades of Hua Chang and Lang Chenchou were about to make contact, Xie Lian flashed in between them. He picked up a sword from the pile of weapons on the shelves and made two moves between the sword and the scimitar. With the first move, he knocked back Lang Chenchou's longsword, and with the second move, he blocked the scimitar, erming. The strength of those two moves was not only powerful, but extremely well controlled. Even when Xie Lian blocked both blades, the force of the strikes were not rebounded onto the attackers, because, with Xie Lian sandwiched in the middle, he used his sword and his own arm to absorb both attacks completely. Lang Chenchou's longsword was manageable, but Hua Chang's scimitar was a force to be reckoned with. The sword Xie Lian used was one from Hua Chang's collection, so naturally it was also a formidable blade. When the two blades met, it blasted that blinding white light. With the two moves, the first strike against Lang Chenchou's longsword created a crack, and the second strike against the scimitar erming shattered the sword to pieces. All of this was done within a fraction of a second, faster than the eye could see. Shi Qingshuan looked at the miserable state of Xie Lian's right hand. The whole right arm was a bloody mess. He commented, Your Highness, you're way too intense. I can't believe you blocked them single-handedly. The flower-crowned martial guard, sword in one hand, flower in the other. Shi Qingshuan only remembered the flower, but had forgotten Xie Lian had ascended because of his sword. Thinking back on how close of a call it was, Shi Qingshuan's heart was still racing. Thank goodness your highness had the moves. Otherwise who knows how many pieces Hua Chang would have cut Lang Chenchou into. The strange thing was that next to them, Lang Chenchou appeared to be unharmed, but his expression was frozen, like his soul had left his body. Chenchou, Shi Qingshuan called. Chenchou, are you all right? Wake up. What's with you? Has your sight not returned yet? Riding on the tailwind, the group of them finally reached the heavenly capital. Dragging and carrying, they rushed past the ascension gates and ran straight for the great martial hall. Lang Ying couldn't enter the hall, so Xie Lian settled him in a small side chamber. No one seemed to be on duty, so he called within the communication array. Is there any honorable official here? Please, everyone, come quickly to the great martial hall. It's an emergency. We have a wounded official. As he shouted, next to him, Shi Qingshuan snapped his fingers and switched back to his white cultivator robe and released 100,000 merits. It's 2 wounded officials, he added. Xie Lian said hurriedly, Lord Windmaster, don't be so excited. We can just talk. There's no need to release any merits. Everyone will naturally come. No, Your Highness, Shi Qingshuan said. You have to know, spreading merits works faster than talking by 100 times. Soon enough, a voice came from afar. Who's wounded? When the word who was uttered, the voice was still far away, but by the last word the person had appeared, and it was Fangxin. He entered the hall and looked at Xie Lian, and then at Lang Chenchou, his face faltering. I'm fine, but Lord Earthmaster seemed to be heavily wounded, Xie Lian said. After a moment of silence, Fangxin said, What happened to your right hand? So what? Another voice came. There's so many heavenly officials. Who ever returned unscathed after a round of patrol? The voice was decorous and mellow, but the words were sharp. It was Mu Qing. He crossed the great hall and also took a look at Xie Lian, and then at Lang Chenchou. Yet his expression was the opposite of Fangxin, having only raised a brow as if ready to spectate a good show. He saw that Fangxin moved to check on Xie Lian's arm, so he bent to check on Ming Yi. He said, So this is Lord Earthmaster. During that exchange, a number of heavenly officials poured into the hall. The Earthmaster Yi had always been inconspicuous and out of sight, so for many, it was the first time they had ever seen him in person, and they cluttered around, staring at him curiously. The masses were mostly confused, not knowing the reason they were called to the great martial hall. But having collected the Windmaster's merits, they had to come and check things out. Thanks, but I'm all right. It'll get better by itself after a while, Xie Lian said to Fangxin. Fangxin didn't mince words. Watch yourself. Xie Lian softly uttered another thanks, but when he turned around, Lang Chenchou was watching him with a frozen expression. Your Highness Tai Hua, what's wrong? He asked. Fangxin also noticed something off about Lang Chenchou and questioned, Was His Highness Tai Hua also injured somewhere? I don't think so. Let me see, Xie Lian said, and extended his hand, reaching for Lang Chenchou's brow. Yet in a flash, Lang Chenchou seized Xie Lian's wrist. There was hesitation on Lang Chenchou's face, as if he had discovered something, but he wasn't sure. A fire had started burning within his eyes. Xie Lian felt a wave of rage trembling from Lang Chenchou's arm to his. Now all the spectating officials had noticed this strange situation and started whispering amongst themselves. Shi Qingshuan and Mu Qing both started to rise, and Fangxin spoke. Your Highness Tai Hua, what are you doing? Lang Chenchou finally moved his lips. He only said 2 syllables, but Xie Lian's heart sank to the very bottom. Goshe? Lang Chenchou gritted his teeth. Xie Lian's pupils shrank slightly. The onlooking officials, half guessing and half confused, muttered, What Guoshe? Who's the Guoshe? Some were more astute and figured it out. Lang Chencho was the crown prince of Yong'an, and the Guoshe of Yong'an during his time was the second of the two wicked masters, the Guoshe Fangxin. No one knew of his origin or his real identity, yet here Lang Chencho had Shilian in his grip and called him Guoshe, meaning Shilian was the evil that brought ruin to Yong'an, the Guoshe Fangxin. However, Shilian was the crown prince of Shanle. The kingdom of Shanle had fallen in the hands of the kingdom of Yong'an, so why would he go and become the Guoshe of Yong'an? The Prince Taihua was renowned for his optimism and cheerfulness, never having played mind games, nor making things difficult for anyone, and he had never exhibited such an expression: despair, rage, enmity, and hatred. Lang Chencho had Shilian in a deathly grip, his breathing becoming harsher, and finally said in a strained voice, I clearly killed you with my own 2 hands, sealed you in a coffin. You, Guoshe, you certainly are a crafty one. Heavens, it looked like something big was about to go down today.